At the start of the 13th century, the papacy was at the peak of its medieval power. Whereas 200 years before Innocent's tenure, the Church had struggled to assert its independence against feudal monarchies, now it was concerned with enhancing its privileges and assuring its supremacy. It now sought to actively undermine secular rulers and intervene in matters of moral expediency. Consequently, kings, factions, and sects emerged that were increasingly hostile to the Church, either because they thought it was heavy-handed or downright detrimental to the salvation of Christendom. The Church had direct control over much of northern Italy, territory that was known as the Papal States, and was drawn into regional conflicts with ever greater frequency. As the papacy's bureaucracy grew, people began to resent its tithes, rents, and taxes. They saw the institution as money-grabbing and too eager to bolster its coffers. It also began to interfere far more in people's daily lives and personal conduct. The Christian sacraments were strictly regulated. Semi-regular church attendance was made mandatory, and the limits of sexual conduct were more rigidly defined. One of the principal points of contention between secular rulers and the papacy was the conflicting legal systems. The jurisdiction of canon law, for example, overlapped with common law in England, which was a technical, practical problem, and legal scholars clashed over the issue. Henry II attempted to solve this issue, which was further complicated by manorial justice, whereby lords could convene their own courts within estates. He created common law, which applied to all non-noble subjects across the realm, and unlike Roman law, relied on precedents to determine legality. Henry formalized trial by jury of 12, which was favourable compared with trial by ordeal or combat. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, opposed the king's plans to limit the Church's judicial authority, and remarked in the presence of his followers, "Will no man rid me of this miserable priest?" This was interpreted as a command for his execution, and Becket was murdered. His killing was considered a martyrdom, and Canterbury became a pilgrimage destination, immortalised in Geoffrey Chaucer's tales. As the Middle Ages reached maturity, the halls of the Vatican began to bustle with lawyers, and the papal bureaucracy grew and grew. At the start of Innocent III's tenure, the Church was deeply in debt and was forever contriving new ways to justify extracting money from believers across Europe, which was reflected in contemporary satires such as The Gospel According to Mark of Silver. Innocent III conceived of the Church's role as the ultimate arbitrator in worldly disputes because of its disinterest in the temporal. Of course, the papacy's neutrality was really a fiction. He was against usury, that is, the practice of lending money at interest, and was eager to intervene in moral issues that everyday feudal subjects encountered, including their private lives and previously non-Christian traditions. Innocent's readiness to encroach upon the authority of secular leaders is exemplified in his treatment of King John of England, whom he ended up excommunicating from the Church. The dispute arose out of a search for a replacement for the Archbishop of Canterbury. John wanted the then Bishop of Norwich, his ally, to take the title, but the cathedral fielded their own candidate, and the province of Canterbury favoured a third. Canterbury Cathedral sent their own nomination, Reginald, to Rome to be confirmed, and John sent his choice after him, along with a message to the Pope. Innocent rejected all candidates and appointed Stephen Langton without John's consent. Langton was banned by John from entering England. Innocent then excommunicated the king and placed an interdict on the country, meaning all sacraments performed in England were invalid. John was forced to surrender England to the papacy to lift this interdict on the promise that he would receive it back if he allowed Langton to serve as archbishop. To add salt to the wound, 2 years later, Innocent condemned John's famous concessions to the feudal barons, the Magna Carta, which he signed in 1215. Innocent III set a precedent for the heavy-handed encroachment of the papacy on the authority of secular rulers. His eagerness to intervene gave rise to a spike in Christian deviation from the Church, known as heresy, whose adherents rejected the clergy and carved out their own unique paths to salvation. One of these groups was the Waldensians, who were pro-poverty, pro-vernacular, and anti-clerical. They applied to the Vatican for papal approval as a religious order, but were refused and survive today in Swiss communities. Another group who did initially get the church's backing were the Beguines, who were an anti-intellectual female order aiming to imitate the life of Christ, and who lived in communes, taking vows of chastity and poverty. They were initially popular, but this popularity worked against them in the long term, because they accumulated great sums of wealth through gifts, which provoked resentment. Eventually, public opinion towards the Beguines declined so much that the Pope forbade new members from joining in 1312, and they literally died out by the middle of the century. The most notorious of the heretics were the Cathars, who numbered tens of thousands and were spread across southern France, northern Italy, Catalonia, and the Rhineland. They were a dualist group who believed in twin deities of good and evil, represented by God and Satan. Cathars thought that the devil had created the physical universe, and that human souls were trapped in bodies, which were the battleground of salvation. To Cathars, sex was evil. They condemned marriage, practiced self-flagellation, and ate a restricted diet. According to their theology, Jesus could not have been human, and the church was a den of thieves. About a century after Innocent III, there was another disruptive pope called Boniface VIII. He issued two important papal bulls called Clericis Laicus and Unum Sanctum. The first exempted the church from taxation, and the second asserted the supremacy of the papacy over everyone, everywhere, and at all times. Philip IV of France opposed this and sent an expedition to arrest the pope, who died in the king's soldiers' custody. A French pope was elected to replace him, and thus began the Avignon papacy, which lasted until 1378, and was followed by 40 years of schism that was finally resolved in 1417 with the Council of Constance.